Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed Ken's breathing session. I certainly did. We can all learn and use these techniques a bit more and take the time to breathe. So, we're already at our last session of the conference, Understanding Clinical Trials. In this session, we will learn about clinical trials, how they may help patients in advanced treatment, and most importantly, how to access trials. We will have two presentations followed by a Q&A. And if you want during the presentation, feel free to use at the top right of your screen the question button to capture your question that we're going to answer during the Q&A. To cover this important topic, we have two wonderful speakers. Catherine Vayssier, who is in charge of clinical research awareness for Q-CROC, le consortium de recherche en oncologie clinique du Québec, a non-for-profit organization that coordinates a clinical cancer research network across the province of Quebec. To join her, we have Dr. Dawn Richards, Director of Patient and Public Engagement for Clinical Trials Ontario. Clinical Trials Ontario is an independent non-for-profit organization that is supported by the Government of Ontario. This is, by the way, a bilingual session, so you will have the opportunity to hear both presentation in the language of your choice as translation is available. Have a good session.
Sera disponible. Bonne séance à vous. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Understanding Clinical Trials. I'm very pleased to present this presentation with Dr. Dawn Richards of the Clinical Trials Ontario organization. I'd like to thank Colorectal Cancer Canada for inviting me to present this webinar. We hope it will help you to discover clinical trials and better understand those trials and what is involved in taking part in such a trial. So my name is Catherine Vayssier. I work as project manager for clinical research awareness for the Consortium of Research in Oncology. That is a consortium in Quebec. Q-CROC was founded in 2008 by physicians and brings together a network of hospitals where oncology research is carried out in Quebec. One of our goals is to raise awareness amongst patients who have cancer and their loved ones to clinical trials.
Merci, Catherine. Hi, everyone. My name is Dawn Richards. I'm here presenting with Catherine on behalf of Clinical Trials Ontario. Clinical Trials Ontario is a not-for-profit organization funded primarily by the Government of Ontario to help improve the environment in Ontario to do clinical trials. My role there is to help with patient and public engagement with clinical trials, which means helping people decide if they would like to be a participant in a clinical trial or if they'd like to also collaborate on clinical trial teams. Well, Catherine and I both represent provincial organizations. What we will share with you today is applicable to anywhere in Canada. Catherine?
Partout au Canada. Catherine, à vous. Today's presentation will be split up in 4 main sections. What is a clinical trial? What is the role of clinical trials in developing drugs? Then, how are clinical trials carried out? We'll speak about the various steps and their goals. And then the third part will focus on participation terms. Who can take part in a clinical trial? What are the eligibility criteria, the questions that the participants must and should ask of themselves? And what are the protection mechanisms for participants rather? And finally, where can one find information on clinical trials in Canada? Next slide. So let us start with a general introduction on clinical research and colorectal cancer. So in recent decades, survival after a colorectal cancer diagnosis improved dramatically. And Those progress were made possible thanks to better understanding of disease and the development of new therapies. So it is research, including clinical research, which enabled such progress. Efforts were maintained, investment in research was maintained, as well as participation in clinical trials. All of those are therefore essential to continue to pursue new development avenues and therapeutic avenues. Now, the takeaway message is that cancer drugs used today were tested within clinical trials involving patients who were diagnosed with a cancer. So what is the state of play today? So currently, hundreds of clinical trials are underway in hospitals throughout Quebec. So I speak about Quebec today because Q-CROC, so the Consortium of Clinical Oncology Research in Quebec, is based in Quebec City. So currently there are some 30 clinical trials ongoing for colorectal cancer. The majority are based in Montreal. And there are also clinical trials open to recruitment in Quebec City, Sherbrooke, Gatineau, and Greenfield Park. So, as regards Canada, clinical trials are underway in most of the Canadian provinces. We will expand later on. As regards the different websites you can consult to find clinical trials in the country. So when one speaks of clinical trials, what does that mean? So clinical trials, how do we define them? Well, those are studies carried out by medical researchers in collaboration with patients. The goal is to assess an experimental therapy or treatment, such as a new drug being tested, or it could be a medical technique, such as in radiology or other types of techniques that are similar. One can also hear about research protocol or clinical trials. Those are synonyms. One carries out clinical research to find more efficient treatments that are better tolerated and which meet important and significant therapeutic needs. So it is very common to hear about clinical trials to assess drugs or combination of drugs, for example, to treat patients with immunotherapy or chemotherapy. But it is important to keep in mind that clinical trials can help assess how to prevent the onset of a disease, how to better diagnose a disease, or how to improve lifestyle or the quality of life rather during disease by controlling nausea or through sleep management, for example. As part of clinical trials on drugs, the safety and effectiveness of the drug and the experimental treatment will be assessed. We want to look at the beneficial effects of the treatment as well as their adverse effects, which we also call the side effects. Please bear in mind that the length of clinical trials can vary greatly. It can be from a few days to several months, and sometimes even several years. So how are clinical trials carried out? So many clinical trials relate to development of future drugs. Nevertheless, a great many clinical trials assess surgery techniques or radiotherapy techniques. So to understand the role of clinical trials, we will use the example of a drug development. So here are the examples which lead to the market entry of a new drug. We chose this example because it is the most straightforward one to understand those steps clearly. The very first step takes place in a laboratory. We will discover new molecules and those molecules may potentially become new drugs. We will assess those molecules, and those that are most promising will go to the second step called preclinical research. That's the step where tests are carried out on animals, and only those molecules that give positive results in animals and which prove to be safe as well in mice or other laboratory animals will enable the product to go to the next step. In other words, the step related to clinical trials. So clinical trials means the research that will be done on human beings. So we've gone from the laboratory to the preclinical research on animals, and now it's clinical trials on human beings. The safety of participants is always the main priority in clinical trials. Clinical trials in human beings will take place in 3 steps, which we call phases 1, 2, 3, and they meet specific goals. More on that later. And finally, once clinical trials are over, the outcome are communicated to national regulatory agencies such as Health Canada, which you heard a great deal of recently, vaccines which were waiting the green light by Health Canada to be administered to us. So this is the same principle, assessment and approval by Health Canada. So Health Canada will assess those results and either approve or disapprove of a drug so that this drug, if approved, can enter the market and therefore be accessible to all the general public. So if we come back to the different steps or phases of the clinical assessment of a drug, so there are 3 distinct phases for clinical trials that need to be accomplished to assess both the safety and effectiveness of an experimental treatment. So the phase 1 clinical trials are those first trials that will resort to human beings, so participants who agree to take part in that study. And the goal is to establish the safe intake of an experimental drug. Even though the treatment was already tested in the laboratory and on animals, uh, the physicians do not yet know the impacts of these drugs on patients living with cancer. So we will run the trials on very small doses to make sure this product is not representing any risks on one's health and assess any detrimental
So
effects.
phase 2 trials allow to
trials
assess
will allow us
the
to better
efficiency,
assess
whether the drug or the treatment is efficient. And this is when doctors are going to look for a efficiency signal. They start thinking, well, maybe this drug will be efficient. It seems to be efficient in this kind of situation. For example, will the experimental treatment that is currently being tested, does it allow to control the growth of a tumor? So this is the kind of things that we do in a phase 2 trial. Next slide. Phase 3. This is where we compare the experimental treatment with existing treatments that are already being used in order to heal people who have cancer. And if they will see whether the treatments are available, and if not, then we will use a placebo to check whether the treatment is efficient or not. This is where you will have the largest number of participants, and you will be more likely to be included in such a trial because usually they recruit more patients, and this means that there are more opportunities to participate in those trials. Then there could also be a phase 4 trial. I haven't mentioned it yet. This is once the drug has been marketed, once it has been approved by Health Canada. Those are studies that are not directly linked with the efficiency of the drug. So there are more long-term studies on specific populations, but this is not what we want to talk
Population,
about.
so that's not the purpose of our presentation today. Next slide, please. So in a randomized trial, as is usually the case in phase 3 trials, we will compare the assessment. So here you can see the diagram. An experimental treatment is compared to a standard treatment, one which is usually used for a treatment program. In this kind of trial, it is important to ensure that the two groups of participants are comparable at the outset. Why? Well, because if at the end of the study we realize that there was a difference between the two groups, we will be able to assume that it's due to the effect of the treatment because nothing else distinguishes the two groups. So the participant allocation and distribution is done randomly, and that allows us to obtain comparable groups at the beginning of the intervention when the study is begun. As you can see on this diagram, you can see that the groups we are observing are all homogeneous. As such, in a clinical trial, it is important information I'd like to give you here. Some participants will indeed receive the experimental treatment, the one that we are studying, to see if that treatment is safe and effective, and the other participants will receive the standard treatment. That will allow us to compare that group with the one which is being administered the care. And as I said, if there's no standard treatment, then we will use a placebo, and that placebo will serve as the control group of our trial. So please also note that in general, neither the physician nor the participants know what kind of treatment they are receiving. And this is to avoid skewing or influencing the outcome of the trial. So you will not know whether you're part of group A or group B, as you can see on the screen, and neither will your physician know. So everyone here is in the dark in a way, and that will allow everyone to assess the results as they are presented. I would like to hand over now to Dawn Richards for the rest of the presentation.
Merci, Catherine. So to carry on with what Catherine had been explaining, the next concept I'd like to share with you is placebo. And the idea behind a placebo is it's an inactive therapy that looks exactly like the active therapy that's being studied. The placebo, though, has no intended effect on the condition being studied. And like randomization, it's used to make the results of the study more reliable. A placebo is only used if there's no standard of care for a condition or disease. Next slide. So let's talk about looking for a clinical trial. Next. So here are some reasons you may be looking for a clinical trial. Perhaps you're out there today and you're living with colorectal cancer or another condition, or maybe you're here today because you have a loved one who lives with a condition or disease. You might simply be interested in research, or sometimes healthy participants are provided compensation to participate in studies. This is often the case with phase 1 studies, where this is a first-in-human type study, and the Research Ethics Board has deemed that the risk these individuals are taking by participating in a phase 1 study would warrant them receiving compensation for their participation. Next. Some questions to ask about a clinical trial to determine if it's reputable or credible are listed here. There may be others as well. But one of them is, are all of the costs of the clinical trial covered? For example, the study treatments. So to be clear, you should not be asked an entry fee to participate in a clinical study, or you should not need to pay for study treatments. You might need to pay to cover your parking, or you might need to take time off work in order to attend a site visit, but you should not be asked to cover other costs associated with a clinical trial. You might examine the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So have they been working in this area for a long time? Maybe they're affiliated with an academic center such as a university. And then there are a number of different organizations and groups that need to review a clinical trial before it's allowed to start. So one is the regulatory agency. In the case of Canada, Health Canada, they have to approve clinical trials applications. A research ethics board does need to review and approve a clinical trial. And here they're looking at the perspectives of the associated with being a participant in the study. And then the institution or organization where the clinical trial is taking place also needs to review and sign off on the clinical trial. So those are a few things to look at for you to decide if a clinical trial is reputable or credible that you're interested in. Next. So while clinical trials are one option, there may be other options that you might wish to consider. And one of those options might be receiving no treatment. Another option might be receiving the standard treatment for a condition or a different form of a treatment than what you're currently on if you live with a disease or a condition. And the third option might be participating in a different research study altogether. What I can share with you is you should talk to your doctor about potential known benefits and risks of these options, including no treatment, and that hopefully will help you make a very personal decision about a clinical trial or another option. So there are different ways to find clinical trials, and some of them are listed here. So one is to talk to your healthcare provider. Some specialists and some healthcare providers may feel very comfortable and know the clinical trial landscape, so that's one option for you. Another option is to ask a health charity or patient organization such as Colorectal Cancer Canada. These organizations are very often in the know about the latest research and the latest clinical trials that are happening. You may wish to contact a hospital or an organization that does research, and maybe Q-CROC is one of those organizations. You may see ads in the newspaper, TV, or on the radio, and those may be things that you choose to follow up on. And a bit later in the presentation, I'll talk to you a little bit about CTO's Clinical Trial Finder. And I know Katrina is going to talk about some other options that are out there for you. So that's a few of the places you might go to if you're interested in finding a clinical trial. Next. So what if you can't find a clinical trial? Well, there are a few things you can do about this. So if there is a clinical trial in another location that you're interested in, one possibility is to reach out and contact the study team. You might ask them if it's even possible for you to participate, given that you're in a different location. And if it is possible, how might this affect you? So how far away is the location? Would you have to pay for your own travel? Would that include nights in a hotel, a caregiver to come with you? Or is that something that potentially the clinical trial sponsor could cover? But those are things to look at. There may be other ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. So maybe there's the potential for a site to be opened in a location that's closer to you. That may take a bit of work, but it is an option. And the last one is to simply keep up to date on research and check time to time on clinical trials. So If you see a clinical trial that you're interested in that maybe is in Montreal right now, and you keep up on it, maybe at another time, it will be at a location closer to you. And that does happen sometimes. Next. Another thing is if your healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial, you can say no. So this decision to be in a clinical trial is completely personal and completely up to you. If you feel that a clinical trial is not the right choice for you, that is okay. And your relationship with that healthcare provider should not change no matter what your decision is about the clinical trial. So those are important to know. Next. So some people take the following into account when they make a decision about a clinical trial. And like I mentioned, this is a really personal decision. You might consult with other people, you might do your homework, but ultimately it is up to you to decide. And you'll notice that the first 5 points here are really similar to deciding if a clinical trial is credible or reputable. So you're going to have to look at what the costs are for the clinical trial. Is that parking? Maybe you have to pay some gas money. Maybe you have to take some time off work. But remember, you should not be paying for study treatments or some kind of entry fee. You're going to look at the qualifications of the clinical trial team, and you're potentially going to look at or ask some questions about if the regulatory agency has approved and reviewed this, if a research ethics board has, and if the institution or organization where the clinical trial is taking place has also reviewed and approved this. In addition to that, if you continue to remain interested in the clinical trial, you will need to meet the eligibility criteria to be in the clinical trial. And these are often things like maybe your sex, maybe you have to live with a certain condition or disease, maybe you have to be on a certain medication or have never taken a certain medication. But those will be things that will be available and publicly available, and you'll have to make sure that you meet those eligibility criteria before you can be part of the clinical trial. Next slide. Informed consent is a process. You've probably heard about the informed consent form that's associated with a clinical trial, and that's one part of informed consent. So importantly, consent is voluntary, so it's up to you if you want to be in a study or not. No one can make you. Consent can be withdrawn at any time, and that's important for you to know that even if you've decided to start a study, at any point, for whatever reason, you may choose to stop participating in the study, and that's okay. And consent is an ongoing process. So it's not just signing the consent form at the start of the study, but it's a process throughout participating in the clinical trial. And it's where you ask lots of questions and you make sure that you feel comfortable and informed and okay with your participation in the clinical trial. If you could just advance, there will be another box that pops up on this slide. Important to know that if you decide to leave a trial, you can also request that any data you've provided as part of the study or any biological sample, so maybe that's blood or urine or tissue, you can ask for those to also be removed from the study. That may or may not be possible, and that will be explained to you, but it's important for you to know that you can ask for that. Next slide, please. Along with deciding about participating in a clinical trial come potential benefits and risks. And again, this is a very personal decision for you to decide if the potential benefits of participating in the clinical trial outweigh the potential risks associated with participation. All of these potential benefits and risks will be different for each clinical trial, and they will be described in the informed consent form. And these are, of course, things that you should feel free to ask as many questions about as you wish from the trial doctor, the clinical trial team. Make sure that you get your questions answered so you feel like you can make a decision that works for you. Next slide. So this concept of withdrawing from a clinical trial, we're just going to touch a little bit more on. So again, just to reiterate, you can end your participation in a clinical trial at any time. You don't need to provide a reason, but you're probably going to be asked for a reason, and that's okay. Again, you can decide what you'd like to share and what you don't wish to share. You are encouraged to make an informed decision about your leaving the clinical trial. And so part of that is likely having a conversation with the study doctor or the staff, and ask again lots of questions that you feel you need to ask before you make a decision to withdraw, just like we would recommend before you decide to participate in a clinical trial. You should note that if you do decide to withdraw from a clinical trial, you may be asked questions about your experience in the clinical trial, and you might be asked to have some lab tests or some physical exams done, and that is to ensure that you can safely stop the study. So that's going to depend on what the study is, but you should know that those things might be asked about you before you formally leave the study. And just to reiterate what we talked about on the last slide, you may be able to withdraw your permission for the study to use the information that's been collected about you, as well as various biological samples you've provided. Again, that may or may not be possible depending on the clinical trial, but you can certainly ask. Next slide. Okay, so lastly, we're just going to talk briefly about where you find information about clinical trials. Next slide. So I brought this up in an earlier slide. Clinical Trials Ontario has what's called a Clinical Trials Finder. The URL is here. It does have an English and a French landing page, but please note that if you are searching in French, that only the headings for the clinical trial information will come back in French. And that's because it searches an English-based database. So the information is there in English, but we can provide a search function that is in French for you to help you out. I want you to note that this finder has been built in collaboration with patient partners, as well as health charities and patient organizations, and Colorectal Cancer Canada has provided us with some feedback. If you can't find a clinical trial using the Finder, there is a subscription service, so you can subscribe to receive an alert at a later date that matches your search functions. So I'll leave that with you. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to pass it over to Katrin, and she's going to speak about some additional resources that you can use.
Que vous pouvez utiliser. So if you want to search and look for some clinical trials on colorectal cancer, here are a few ideas. For Quebec, you have access to the OncoQuebec platform. This is the reference website. It's called oncoquebec.com. This platform was developed by our organization, and it regroups almost 98% of the clinical trials that are currently recruiting patients in Quebec. If you want to go beyond Quebec, you have the possibility to go onto the Canadian Cancer Trial website. It's canadiancancertrials.ca. It's up on the screen also. You will find information for all Canadian provinces, and you can also do a specific search for colorectal cancer. You also have the website called clinicaltrials.gov, and this website has all the international clinical trials that are currently taking place worldwide. So you will find clinical trials in other Canadian provinces, but also in all the countries in which clinical trials are performed. Next slide, please.
Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, lastly, I just wanted to also emphasize with CTO's Clinical Trial Finder, you can search any province or territory in Canada, as well as all of Canada. It does sit on top of clinicaltrials.gov, so it searches the database that Katrin just talked about. I also just wanted to highlight that you may wish to visit our patients and public website that has also been built in collaboration with patient partners, health charities, and patient organizations. And I've also left my email address there. So if you'd like to reach out to me with any questions that you've had about the presentation today, I'm happy to answer them now in our discussion, as well as after the fact if you feel better about sending me a private email. And I think Katrin and I are now happy to take any questions and look forward to the discussion that we're going to have with you. Thank you very much.
Merci, Catherine. Thank you so much, Dawn. This was certainly enlightening and clarified important information to better understand the role of clinical trials, but also how to access it for patients. So let's proceed to our audience to hear the questions they have for you on this topic. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a question for Catherine or Dawn, you can just click on the question button at your top right of your screen and just capture your question. We're going to answer them. Bonjour Catherine, hello Dawn. So we have a few minutes for questions. Maybe the first one, there's a question from Iris asking, clinical trials are sometimes like seen and thought as kind of last resort. How true is this, and how can we, or how true is it, especially for cancer treatment? Like that myth of being a last resort opportunity.
Katrin, did you want to take that, or I'm happy to start.
Je vais répondre donc en français. Alors, en fait, il existe des essais cliniques, pas seulement, on dirait, pour des personnes.
There are some people who have no other standard treatments that are working. There has been no response. Everything has been tried. So this could be an option for a patient to take part in a clinical trial. But you must know that you can participate in a clinical trial regardless of the stage of your disease. And you can also participate in clinical trials that are aimed at improving the diagnosis and also cancer prevention. So there are all sorts of clinical trials, and many people can participate. You can really envisage participating in a clinical trial at any time.
Merci, Catherine. As you answer the question, the translation is also active, so feel free to answer in French for sure. Dawn, was there anything to add to this?
No, I think Katrin did a really nice job of answering. I think, people have different motivations to participate in studies too, and so it's a very personal decision. For some people at various different stages of their disease, they may feel really comfortable with this option, and for others, unfortunately, they may just see it as a last resort, but that's a very personal thing.
Okay. Another question that is being also, because in the question, people can also like some question to prioritize them. So a question that's being prioritized right now as we speak is, what do I do if I'm interested in the clinical trials, but my oncologist isn't interested in seeing if I'm eligible? What can they do if there's a roadblock there? Who wants to take this question? Catherine, do you want to start?
Vous voulez commencer? Yes, I can answer that question. This is something that can occur, indeed. And if this is the case, if you are really willing to participate in a clinical trial, you always have the possibility to look in a register and try and find a clinical trial that would be suitable for you. It's a bit difficult to do because the criteria are sometimes difficult to understand. So if this is the case, I would suggest that you get in touch with a patient association such as Colorectal Cancer Canada. They will support you, they will accompany you in order to help you find a suitable clinical trial. And you should also visit some websites such as our website, CTO or Q-CROC, depending on where you live. And you will find also some information on clinical trials. And this is what our organizations want to do. They're here to assist you. So go and look for some support because it is a bit cumbersome and difficult. So look for help.
Merci, Catherine. So I understand going to those resources and patient association, Cancer Colorectal Canada, and you guys. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So before we go to closing remarks, maybe to build on that, and going a little bit to the earlier question we had, there's a question, and maybe Dawn, if you want to take this one, it's unfortunately, like we hear a lot about the stigma. So we discussed a little bit the last resort perception, but there's another stigma that the audience is putting up around participating in clinical trials and being guinea pigs. So how can we kind of demystify, I would say, this kind of this guinea pig perception?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's something we hear quite often. I think to keep in mind is there are a number of ways that clinical trials are made as safe as possible for people to participate in. It's really important to understand that, as Catherine said, new molecules or procedures have to go through often a number of years of research before they can go into people. So there's often much research that's done. And while sometimes what happens in animals doesn't exactly happen in the same way in people, people have tried to make these interventions as safe as possible to enter humans. And there are many different aspects related to safety about clinical trials. So for example, I talked about a lot of them, that many different people and organizations review the clinical trials before they can happen. There is a lot of oversight amongst all different types of phases of studies where participants are very closely watched and monitored. So there are lots of different safety mechanisms, and there's a lot of research that happens before clinical trials go into people. So I just caution you to, before you think that way, really do your homework around them, really make sure that you feel comfortable with the questions that you have get answered to the way that you feel comfortable, and know that much has gone into what is then going into a clinical trial. So there are some potential risks, there are some potential benefits, and not all of them are always known. And these are experimental studies, so those are important things to be aware of. But again, a lot's gone into them to try and make them as safe as possible for participants.
Thank you so much, Dawn. So that concludes our last session of the conference. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Dawn, for being there. And then we're going to turn over to the closing remark. But again, thank you so much again for that discussion about such an important topic and really kind of demystifying like all the surrounding about clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, well, that wraps up our conference. These were certainly 2 amazing days of learning, of sharing, and I have to say of humbling for me personally. So I hope everyone in the audience gain additional network, part of the community to engage with, learn new things, obviously, and realize that, again, you're not alone in that journey. And hopefully that you're leaving feeling a little bit more supported and empowered, thanks to Colorectal Cancer Canada organizing this conference. So I will pass the mic, if I may say, to Barry for any final thoughts and reflection as we close what has been, I believe, an amazing first annual gathering for the colorectal cancer community. Barry.
Thanks so much, Dominique, for excellent moderating throughout this entire 2-day conference. We really appreciate it, and it was fantastic to have you with us throughout this presentation. And thank you to all of our presenters, panelists, and of course, all of our participants. And a special thank you to all of our sponsors, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. I hope that the presenters today and the panelists kept you all engaged and that you found the information interesting and helpful, and most of all, that you left feeling somewhat empowered with this additional information, and knowing that we've built friendships and that can continue long after this conference, hopefully. And we sincerely apologize about the technical difficulties in the breakout rooms. We'll get that right the next time, absolutely. So this was our first time with this really excellent platform. We had a lot of fun in the virtual rooms and in the exhibition halls. And hopefully everybody has taken their photo in the photo booth so we can have a nice souvenir of this event for yourselves as well, because you can save those pictures. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to let us know. We are here to help you. You can write us at info@colorectalcancercanada.com. You can find us on our website at colorectalcancer.canada.com. You can see us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at @ColonCanada as well. So whatever way you want to reach us, we're here for you. Over the course of this conference, we had several hundred participants. I know it didn't look like that at times, but people were in and out. We had over 300 participants. And because of this excellent response, we intend to hold another conference later on this year. And don't forget, we also will be holding in October our clinical trials conference and real world evidence. In the meantime, this platform that you're on right now will be open for the next 3 months. So you can view any of the sessions. I don't know exactly when it'll be up, but I think probably in the next day or so, it will be up and you'll be able to see all the sessions if you missed any of them. And please do tell other patients and caregivers about this opportunity. They're such fantastic speakers and we had such rich information. It will really be to their benefit. And finally, if you or a friend or a family member needs support, you want to advocate, volunteer, participate in any of our events, or have any questions, do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you for joining us. I look forward to hearing from you.